Chapter 1, The Night the System Answered. They tell you a system always answers on your 16th birthday. Mine didn't. For 6 years I was the only person I knew walking around with a blank interface, and everyone around me had a name for what that meant: dud. Empty. A late bloomer who never actually bloomed. My name is Micah Reyes. On the night my uncle stood in front of the whole engineering division and thanked his son, Trevor, for single-handedly designing the pressure regulation system that was about to save the company $40 million a year, I finally understood what 6 years of silence had actually been waiting for. I had designed that system. Every line of it. 11 months of nights in a shared lab after everyone else had gone home, because Uncle Harold said junior staff needed to earn their desk before their name went on anything. I earned it. Then he put his own son's name on it instead, in front of 200 people, and smiled at me while he did it, as if daring me to say something. That night, walking home in the cold with my badge already deactivated, my interface finally bloomed. Not gold, not triumphant. A plain gray ledger, line by line, quietly totaling a number I hadn't known was being counted at all. Chapter 2, The House of Reyes. To understand what happened, you have to understand the company first, because in our family the company was never separate from the family, it was the family. Reyes Industries was built by two brothers, my father, Daniel Reyes, and my uncle, Harold Reyes. My father was the engineer. Harold was the one who understood contracts, margins, and rooms full of investors. Together they built something real out of a rented workshop and a single patent for a valve seal that nobody else had gotten right. My father died when I was 11, a heart condition nobody caught in time, the kind of quiet failure that doesn't make headlines. Harold took me in afterward, and for years I believed that was kindness. I understand now it was also insurance, keeping my father's only son close, inside the company, where whatever I built could stay inside the family name Harold controlled. Chapter 3, What the Workshop Teaches You. I started in the workshop at 16, the same summer my interface should have bloomed and didn't. Harold called it paying dues. I called it, at the time, an honor, working with my hands on the same benches my father once stood at, learning the business from the ground up the way he supposedly had. What I actually learned was quieter and colder. Every design I improved got folded into team output. Every late night I put in got credited to the division. My cousin Trevor, 2 years younger and considerably less interested in the actual engineering, got his name on the door of an office before he'd finished a single project without my direct help. I told myself this was normal for family businesses. I told myself a lot of things, for a long time. Chapter 4, The Credit Line. There's a particular kind of theft that never shows up on any balance sheet, and it took me years to learn how to actually see it. Every patent filing that came out of the division during those years listed Reyes Industries R&D team as the inventor of record, with Harold's signature as the authorizing executive. Not one of them listed me by name, even on filings I had solely designed start to finish. When I finally asked, at 23, why my name never appeared on anything, Harold told me, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, that the company's name is bigger than any one person's, Micah. That's how we protect the work. He said it like a lesson. It was a ledger entry, and I simply hadn't learned to read it as one yet. Chapter 5, The System N01 explains. Twice. Here is what my gray interface actually said, the first time I read it closely enough to understand it: tracks value unjustly extracted. Converts documented, provable loss into usable resource. Undocumented loss converts to nothing. That last part mattered more than anything else about it. This was never a system that rewarded resentment or private grievance. It rewarded proof. Every design I could timestamp, every draft saved with a date, every witness who could honestly say, yes, I saw him build that, those became real, spendable resource once the system could verify them. Every insult I only felt but couldn't document stayed exactly what it was, a feeling, not fuel. I started keeping records before I fully understood why. Dated design files. Saved emails. Photographs of whiteboards after long nights, before anyone erased them. My mother's habit, if I'd had one to inherit, I built my own instead, out of necessity, see the true origin of a thing, and write it down before someone else can rewrite the story. Chapter 6. The patent. The pressure regulation system was the one Harold couldn't quietly absorb into team output, because it was too valuable to bury. It was the single biggest efficiency gain the company had made in a decade, and everyone above him wanted a name attached to celebrate. He gave them Trevor's. I had the dated design files. I had the lab access logs showing exactly whose badge swiped in at 11 p.m. on 43 separate nights that year. I had 2 colleagues who had seen the early prototypes on my bench, weeks before Trevor's name was ever mentioned in connection with the project. None of it mattered in that room, that night, when Harold stood at the front and thanked his son. Proof doesn't stop a lie from being spoken. It only outlasts it. Chapter 7. What Trevor did not say. Trevor was in that room. He knew, better than anyone besides Harold and me, exactly whose work was being applauded under his name. He said nothing. Not a correction, not a quiet word afterward, not even real discomfort that I could see on his face, just the practiced smile of someone who had been groomed his whole life to accept credit gracefully and never examine where it came from. I don't think Trevor set out to steal anything from me directly. I think, more simply, he had never once been taught to ask whether what he was given was actually his. That's its own kind of theft, learned rather than chosen, and somehow it still costs the person on the other end of it exactly the same amount. Chapter 8. The termination. The termination came 4 days later, dressed up as divisional restructuring, delivered by an HR representative I'd never spoken to before, with Harold conspicuously absent from the meeting. Nora Malik, the design lead who had backed my work in 3 separate internal reviews over the years, was let go in the same round, officially for redundant role overlap, which was a strange way to describe someone whose signature was on the safety approval for half of what shipped that year. We both understood, without saying it directly in that hallway, exactly what had actually happened and exactly why the timing wasn't a coincidence. Chapter 9. The first year. I will not dramatize what came after more than it deserves. I took contract engineering work where I could find it, inspection jobs, small consulting gigs, the unglamorous work that doesn't ask for a company name behind you, only correct answers. What I did have, every single day of that first year, was the system quietly converting every piece of provable, documented value I'd ever built into something real, and a decision I made early on, sitting in a rented single room going over my saved files late one night. I would not spend my life trying to make people believe me through argument. I would spend it building something so demonstrably, provably better that argument would never be necessary. Chapter 10. Fairline Engineering. I started a small engineering consultancy out of that same rented room, under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might have recognized me, Fairline Engineering. No flash, no borrowed prestige, just correct, well-documented work, sold to clients who needed something built right and were tired of paying premium prices for someone else's shortcuts. Every project file was dated, witnessed, and archived properly from day one. Not out of obsession, out of habit, the same habit that had quietly saved my career once already. I had decided a fair record, kept honestly and completely, was worth more in the long run than any single dramatic confrontation could ever be. Chapter 11. Nora found her way to Fairline 18 months later, after 2 other firms had quietly passed her over for promotion despite better numbers than the men they'd chosen instead, a pattern she recognized immediately once she saw how Fairline actually operated. She didn't know at first that I was the same Micah Reyes from that final review meeting years earlier. When she found out, months in, she said only that it explained a lot, the meticulous documentation, the refusal to ever let a design ship without a full paper trail behind it. She became the head of design review at Fairline, with real authority and a real signature that meant something, because I had learned exactly what it costs to have neither. Chapter 12. Samuel Okafor had run quality control on the production floor at Reyes Industries for 9 years, flagging the same recurring defect in a valve housing 3 separate times through the proper internal channels, each time getting overruled by someone deciding the fix would slow the shipping schedule. He was let go the same year I was, for what his termination letter called failure to meet productivity benchmarks, a strange charge against the one person on that floor who had been trying to stop a problem before it became expensive. Samuel came to Fairline the way most of my early people did, quietly, through word of mouth among people who had learned which employers actually wanted the truth and which ones only wanted agreement. Chapter 13, Reyes Industries Ascendant. While I built Fairline in the background, one documented project at a time, Reyes Industries kept growing in the light, riding the credit for work it had taken from people it had already discarded. Harold was celebrated at every industry dinner as a visionary who had modernized the company's whole product line practically overnight. Nobody in those rooms thought to ask why a man who hadn't personally touched a design in 15 years suddenly had such sharp instincts for engineering. The answer was simple and unflattering: he didn't. He had simply gotten very good at putting his name, and his son's name, on work that was never fully theirs to claim. Chapter 14, The Corners Cut. Trevor, now running most of engineering in name if not in practice, began quietly waving through cost-cutting changes that the people who actually understood the designs kept warning against: cheaper housing materials, shortened testing cycles, safety margins trimmed down to the legal minimum instead of the responsible one. Samuel had warned about exactly this kind of pressure years before he was ever fired for it. Nobody left inside Reyes Industries with the standing to say no was still in the room to say it. The people who might have caught the problem early were gone, replaced by people whose job had quietly become agreement rather than honest scrutiny. Chapter 15, The Cracks Beneath. For years, none of this showed on the outside. Reyes Industries products still shipped, still sold, still carried a reputation built on decades of my father's original, genuinely excellent engineering. Reputation is a slow thing to spend down, even once the substance behind it has quietly eroded. I watched all of this from a careful distance, the way you watch a structure you used to help build slowly weaken from cut corners you can see and they can't. I did not cause a single one of those cuts. I want to be exact about that, because it matters to me far more than anything that came after. I only declined, for a long time, to warn them, and declining to volunteer a warning to people who have shown no interest in the truth is not the same thing as causing the collapse. Chapter 16, The Honest Bid. The turning point arrived as something almost mundane: a regional infrastructure contract for pressure regulation systems in municipal water treatment, awarded through a genuinely blind technical review, no names on the submitted designs, just performance data and safety margins, judged by an independent panel of engineers. Reyes Industries assumed their name alone would carry the bid, the way it always had. Fairline, quietly built into a real engineering firm by then, with Samuel's production discipline and Nora's design rigor behind every submission, actually earned it. We won on the numbers, blind, with no name attached at all. It was the first time in years that anything about my work had been judged purely on whether it was actually correct. Chapter 17, What the record showed. Once the contract became public, an ordinary industry journalist doing routine due diligence on the winning bid discovered something Reyes Industries hadn't anticipated anyone ever checking: the original 2019 patent filings for their core pressure regulation technology, cross-referenced against internal lab access logs that had never been sealed, that Fairline's own founder, me, held provable, dated authorship of. I hadn't leaked it. I hadn't needed to. Public contract records are, by design, exactly the kind of proof my system had always rewarded: dated, witnessed, impossible to quietly erase. The truth simply became findable the moment someone with a real reason to look actually looked. Chapter 18, The Recall. Almost simultaneously, and unrelated to the patent story except in the sense that neglect tends to arrive in clusters, a batch of the very valve housing Samuel had warned about years earlier began failing in the field, the exact defect he had flagged 3 times before being let go for raising it. There was no scheme behind the recall. It was simply years of warnings nobody senior enough had chosen to hear, finally becoming impossible to ignore any longer. Regulators opened an inquiry. The trail led, plainly and without any need for exaggeration, straight back to the internal report Samuel had filed and Reyes Industries had buried. Chapter 19, The investigator. An independent safety investigator, brought in once the recall made headlines, requested internal records going back nearly a decade, and found exactly what years of unheeded warnings leave behind for anyone patient enough to actually read the file, Samuel's original reports, time-stamped and ignored 3 times over, and a pattern of design credit that didn't match the actual authorship trail the patent story had already surfaced. None of this required me to say a single word publicly. The record, once someone finally opened it properly, spoke for itself. Chapter 20. Nora's Archive. Nora had quietly kept her own complete design review archive from her years at Reyes Industries, long after she had any professional reason to, kept out of nothing but the same stubborn habit of documentation that had made her good at her job in the first place. She handed it to the investigator without being asked twice. It was never about revenge for her, and I don't think that surprised the investigator as much as it probably should have. It was simply refusing, after years of being overruled, to let an accurate record stay buried any longer than it already had been. Chapter 21. The Industry Dinner. Reyes Industries held its annual industry dinner the same week the investigators' findings were set to become public, an evening meant to celebrate the very product line built on my father's original work and, underneath it, on credit that was never fully Harold's or Trevor's to take. I attended, invited as Fairline's founder among the other award nominees for that year's blind judged contract, wearing a plain dark suit and a name most of the room hadn't yet connected to the family that once employed me. Harold didn't recognize me at first, across a room he had always assumed would keep loving him without ever once checking his math. Chapter 22. The proof. He found me near the end of the evening, as the findings began circulating quietly through the room in the kind of murmurs that rearrange every face at once. "You did this to us," he said, and for the first time in my life I watched something like real fear behind his eyes. "I didn't do this," I told him, evenly. "I only stopped being the one who quietly covered for what you'd already done." I told him plainly what the fair share system had actually been converting, patiently, for years, while everyone assumed my blank interface meant I had nothing at all, every dated file, every witnessed late night, every report Samuel filed and you buried, every design Nora backed and you dismissed. Not power that glows once in a ballroom and needs constant defending afterward. Just an honest, provable record, finally read by people with the authority and the reason to actually read it. Chapter 23. What remains. I did not try to take the company apart. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy, and it would have cost hundreds of people their jobs for nothing but my own satisfaction, people who had done honest work under a name that didn't deserve them. The board, once the findings were public, moved Harold and Trevor out of operational control and asked Fairline to lead the redesign of the affected product line under proper, transparent authorship this time. I agreed, on the condition that Samuel ran production quality with real authority, and Nora led design review with her name, her actual name, on everything she approved. Chapter 24. The habit that remains. As for me, I kept the habit the system had simply given a place to compound, see the true origin of a thing, and write it down before anyone else gets the chance to rewrite the story. Don't stop keeping the record, even when everyone around you has already decided, with total confidence, that you have nothing worth documenting at all. That habit was never really the system's gift. The system only rewarded what the habit had already built, patiently, one dated file at a time, long before anyone thought to ask whose work it actually was. Chapter 25. A closing word. I'm not telling you this story to make you trust people more easily, or less. I paid enough, over enough years, that I don't have an easy lie to hand you at the end of it. Here is the only thing I know for certain: keep an honest, complete record of what is actually true, even when, especially when, no one around you seems interested in checking it. Truth that can be proven outlasts credit that was only ever borrowed. Sooner or later, the record gets read by someone with a real reason to look. Be ready for that day by having already told the truth, in writing, all along.